Hey everyone, this is Charles Hoskinson broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. Always warm, always sunny, sometimes Colorado. I didn't have time yesterday, but I have a little bit of time in my schedule today. Before I go home, I wanted to talk a little bit about proof of work versus proof of stake. And actually, this video is made for Jack Dorsey. So yesterday, Jack said, proof of work is better than proof of stake because proof of work is less centralized and more secure. And this is a common thing that people that are indoctrinated in the school of Bitcoin tend to say, and it's a bizarre thing. Normally, most people, laymen, don't have strong opinions on consensus protocols in computer science. It's kind of like saying, what is your favorite surgical procedure or method to stitch up a patient? If you're a surgeon, you'll probably have a way of going about that and an opinion. But if you're a layman, you'd be like, I have no idea. I don't know. I like cholecystectomies or something like that. Who knows? And so what's happened, though, is because everybody wants to be an expert, everybody wants to talk about these things. What we've had is this unfortunate conversation, which is really difficult to actually converge to anything meaningful. And the purpose of this video is to kind of talk a little bit about how to think about these things. And if you're actually curious of doing the hard work of developing a good opinion, I'm going to give you guys some great resources specifically for that. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And there we go. Okay, so the first thing to look at is this lovely paper from Leslie Lamport. And actually, this is one of the most famous papers in computer science, Times, Clocks, and the Ordering of Events in Distributed Systems. And Leslie published this back in, I think it was the 1970s. And it has about 12,000 citations. It's one of the most cited papers in the history of computer science. And this paper really outlines kind of a difficult problem. And it discusses ways you go about thinking about it and solving it. So ordinarily, when you're just a single person and you're observing something, so let's say that you're Alice. Okay. We'll give her a nice little dress. And you see an event. We'll call that event A. And then you see event B. Okay. And this is occurring in a local setting. Alice can order these and say, oh, okay, well, event A happened first and then event B. All right, but the problem is when you start introducing more actors, like right here's Bob, and he's witnessing it, and from Bob's perspective, looking at it, he saw event B first, that happened first, and then he saw event A, that happened second. The question is, who's right?
No, era más difícil.
Or is it Alice? It's a really interesting question, and Lamport actually discusses this amongst other concepts, and he calls it kind of a partial ordering, and there's all kinds of things that come from it. And it's actually created a beautiful, lovely field of computer science called distributed systems, and for this work and other work, Lamport was awarded the Nobel Prize in Computer Science, the Turing Award. And he's a lovely guy. He recently came spoke at our internal seminar, and we had a chance to talk about ELA amongst other things. I was trying to goad him into talking about clocks and Paxos, and he's like, oh, I don't do that anymore. I do PLA. And if you're really curious and you really want to learn all these principles, first you kind of have to learn these types of things running on a single computer, then you go to the next level up, which is a collection of computers that are in different locations. And I have two wonderful resources for you guys. First, a series of lectures out of MIT. It's MIT 6.824, the Distributed Systems class. And it covers introduction, RPC and threads, GFC and replication and Go and threads and so forth, all the way down. It actually eventually talks about Bitcoin. And then there's another series of lectures from Martin Kleppmann over at the University of Cambridge, and these cover all kinds of cool topics as well. And it's an 8-part lecture series. So I'd recommend both of these very highly. They're not for the layman. You have to kind of have a pretty good programming background and understand computer science to be able to make the best out of it. But the point is, this is a topic unto itself, and it's something, that's why I mentioned the surgery situation. It's something you really have to have a lot of knowledge to start developing a strong opinion about certain things. But in general, when you talk about these types of problems, the first thing that you do is you try to work on definitions and foundations. And one of the things that our scientists did, they wrote a lovely paper which actually has about 1,100 citations. And this is the GKL paper. Its formal name is the Bitcoin Backbone Protocol Analysis and Applications. And this has been cited as much as pretty much any other crypto paper 1,100 times. It's a very famous paper. It's by Wang Gray, who's at Texas A&M, and two IOHK alums, Agalos, our chief scientist, and Nikolai Nardis, who's running the University of Athens lab with others. And basically what this paper does is it tries to create definitions and foundations. So it creates some foundational functions, this concept of a content validation predicate, an input contribution function, and so forth. And it gives you a way of talking about a cryptocurrency protocol. And so then you get properties out of it. Two in particular, the common prefix property and the chain quality property. And what this is really nice is it's a theoretical foundation. And you can prove all kinds of interesting and nice properties about this foundation, but then once you have that, what you can do is develop what's called a security model. Okay? So what a security model does is it says, all right, I have some sort of adversary, and he's evil. Little monocle and top hat. And the adversary basically is always trying to break things. What your security model basically tells you is when they're going to win and when they're going to lose. Okay, so what attacks are you defending against and what attacks are you not defending against? And it's always connected to the capabilities of the adversary. Okay, so your capabilities, for example, do they have a classical computer? Do they have access to your computer? Can they eavesdrop on the communication medium and collect messages? Or maybe they have a quantum computer. Okay? So oftentimes you'll hear things like cryptocurrencies are not secure against quantum computers. What they're basically saying is if your adversary has a quantum computer capability, then the security model may not hold and the adversary may be able to win. And this is what cryptographers think about when they're modeling and building protocols. So there's plenty of protocols that allow you to sort out orders and decide when events have happened, your transaction or my transaction, and basically be the engine of a distributed system. So in the case of cryptocurrencies, you have to move from one block to another block, and those protocols may be what are called Byzantine fault tolerant or non-Byzantine. You might not be able to admit it. In other words, can you have an adversary in your system, and will the presence of that adversary break the system or not? So here's an example of a non-Byzantine fault tolerant, very simplistic protocol. Let's say you have a set of 7 people. And what you do is you say, oh, okay, we're going to pick from this set of 7 people who gets to be in charge and make a block for our blockchain. And what we're going to do is have a random number generator, have each and every one of them run a random number generator, and whichever one is the minimum, that's going to be the winner for that round. Okay? And actually, Intel did do this. This is, I think, a proof of elapsed time or something like that for something called Sawtooth. Now, on normal computers, this is actually not a secure algorithm, because what I can do is I can just hijack my random number generator, and let's say it returns something from 0 to 1. I can just hijack my random number generator and say, all right, just always return 0, which means I always win. Everybody else will have a value equal to or greater than mine. Okay, so that does not admit a Byzantine actor. Sawtooth does, because the random number generator actually runs on SGX. Can't modify the code. Now, this is an example. So there's a lot of nuances and elegance to how these protocols are developed, but you always, whenever you're developing a protocol, even proof of work, implicitly or explicitly, you need some notion of a definition and you need to create some sort of security foundation. It was unfortunate that Satoshi did not do that. It was a brilliant and inspired protocol based on Hashcash, proof of work, but it took years for cryptographers to get around to retroactively building a foundational model to kind of understand what happened with Nakamoto proof of work. And actually, it turns out that there's a lot of nice security properties of work. And let's talk about that. So, really, when you think about a cryptocurrency protocol, a blockchain, you have three things that happen. First, you have to pick someone to make a block. Okay, that's step one. Then two, you need to go ahead and make the block and distribute it. Make and push to the network. And then three, the network has to accept the work. All right. So all the energy consumption of Bitcoin occurs in the picking to make a block. So what happens is you have this proof of work that people do, and they're basically buying like computational lottery tickets. And if you get a magic number, you hit a magic value that's below some target, then you have a valid block. Okay, and this is an egalitarian meritocratic process, and it's an external. So mining is not incumbent within Bitcoin. It's an external thing. I have to have an external miner. I have to have an ASIC that basically do this process competitively. And I can either do it solo, or I can do it with a private pool, which is many ASICs together, or I can do it with a distributed pool, where I actually contribute with some sort of work.
Puta caja de mierda.
Now, proof of stake and proof of work are functionally identical on these two sides. Number 2 and number 3. Okay, so POS does this, proof of work does this. You make and push blocks, you do it the same way. You can take a proof of stake algorithm and plop it on top of the Bitcoin system, and for the most part it's going to be that way with some... And then you're going to have validation rules, ledger rules, acceptance rules for whether those blocks look good or not. The easiest way of thinking about this conceptually is kind of like a poker game. Somebody has to be the dealer, shuffles the deck, and deals out the cards. Step 2 is the dealing of the cards. Step 1 is picking the dealer. And step 3 is you picking up the deck and looking at it and looking at those cards. What that effectively does is you have 5 aces. If you have an information card, a joker, you'd say, well, hang on a second here, this is not a valid hand. And so the question is, can you do a complete validation, or a partial validation, or a blind validation? What level of validity do you have with the way the blocks are made? So various consensus algorithms and ledger rules in the cryptocurrency space, because many of them have different levels of things. In the case of Bitcoin, it attempts to be a completely trustless system. So when you receive that block, you can check the proof of work, you can check the contents of the block, and you'll have an entire collection of history. You're able to validate, assuming honest majority, that block is real and legitimate, not going to be rolled back. So it's a very powerful deterministic system, and that's actually quite rare to have with decentralization. That's why Bitcoin is so great. But that first step, that collection of magic value, as I mentioned, is where all of the energy consumption occurs. 99.9999997% of all the energy occurs there. And basically what proof of stake does is it says, okay, let's invent some sort of synthetic resource. So mining capabilities, ASICs, are a resource. That's the way to think about them. And for any given time period, there's going to be some set of all ASICs. So if you can union that whole set of ASICs and add them all together, this right here is the total pool of resource. And when you think about a synthetic resource, basically what you're doing is saying, oh, okay, well, if I have 25% up here of the ASICs, on average, I should be able to find those magic numbers 25% of the time. So if I have 25% of this synthetic resource, on average, my expected value is 25% of the time, I get to be the dealer. I get to be that person who wants to make the block. And then I can go make the block and push it. And of course, if it's accepted, I get paid for that profit. Okay. So the question is, the distribution of this synthetic resource, is it fair?
No viene aquí
and also, is it secure?
Jugar a divertirse,
Okay?
A dejar
So
de tener un mal día y
you
terminar
need
con
a
esta
security
pillez.
model against an adversary to even be
Que me
able to have
aparece
a
el
meaningful
hijueputa
discussion, which is
fallando.
why this paper is so incredibly important, because you can then have a very
Paso
rigorous
decisivo.
conversation about what security properties does proof of work provide. And then if you're going to create a synthetic resource and build a different type of system, what security properties does that system have? And wrote that paper. So this paper, or Varus, originally came out in 2017, but it was updated in 2019 to reflect all kinds of new, cool, interesting things that were gathered. And this is built with that GK model. So basically what the paper does is it talks about the design challenges of a proof of stake. And really they're saying, okay, how do I get that synthetic resource to work properly? And how do I use that synthetic resource to correctly pick a collection of people to make those blocks? And you, of course, have to model this, and you have to create rigorous security proofs for these types of things. And so, you go down and you actually take a look at the entire model, and it talks about time and synchrony. Where have we seen that before? Well, here we go, 1978, Lamport stuff. Probably even cite Lamport's paper, which surprised me in this paper. Everybody does. Academia work. And then it talks about liveness properties and all those things. Honest chain growth, existential chain quality, and common prefix from GPL. And what it does is it, over time, builds up a big security model. It kind of discusses that if you use this under the assumptions that are inside this paper, that basically you'll have equivalent security to the proof of work security. Now, the problem is we're using that term assumption.
Hola, buenas, ¿y si me ayudan?
It is the most dangerous term in all of computer science, that and ideal functionality. And those assumptions basically says that this evil adversary we have here can only be defeated
Ay, lo más bueno es que
under the
uno
model
ese
and the
puede
assumptions
hacer
that we
una buena
use.
play, pero el bobazo ese no ayuda.
And just because we have a peer-reviewed paper doesn't mean that there's guaranteed security against all types of adversaries and all types of conditions. For example, the computers that are talking to each other, there's different communication models. So when you send a signal to the computers, you can have them all occur in a synchronous time, or they could occur in a partially synchronous time, or they could be asynchronous. And there's a very cool thing called the Fisher-Lynch-Patterson possibility fault. It actually talks about some fundamental limitations if your system is asynchronous versus synchronous or partially synchronous, so forth, about the level of security that you can have. And it's just
Wow, bro,
how
el
messages are
614, esa
passed.
vaina no
Another
es
thing is how many
ni
Byzantine
sin culpa.
actors can you have in your system?
A
Is it a
propósito.
third? That's very common for
Bueno.
sharded protocols and asynchronous
No me acuerdo
systems.
en qué
Is
clase
it
de filosofía
a
estamos
fourth?
hablando de
Is it
alguien
50%?
y se dice que no se
And
puede
it turns
dar
out
una
actually
vida
Bitcoin
por
has
cosas que
a
no
lot
podemos
of
controlar.
really amazing properties with proof of work. For example, you have the ability to recover from attacks. So let's say that there's a attack on the system. Over time, an honest minority can, if they stick around and keep mining, when the attacker stops, the minority chain can undo the majority chain and we can recover. So there's a disaster recovery mechanism that is within proof of work. Proof of work mostly is partially synchronous or asynchronous, depending upon who you ask. This is a bugbear of a few people in space, like Andrew Miller. And that means that it can operate in very uncomfortable network conditions. You don't know ahead of time who's going to find that magic value. That's not necessarily the case in a lot of consensus algorithms. A lot of consensus algorithms, you know who the next person is going to be to make that block. It's like knowing who the next dealer is going to be. So you can go and force or attack that dealer. Bitcoin is not predictable. In addition to that, Bitcoin actually generates a pretty reasonable source of randomness. It's not perfect and it's subject to binding attacks, but you get a reasonable supply of that. So you have a lot of great security properties in addition to a 50% or 1/2 Byzantine resistance. And so to replicate those for proof of stake is non-trivial. You have to come up with creative new ways of getting sources of randomness, be able to make the selection of people fair. You have to be able to recover from 50